just want to preface these comments. I thank Father Cyril for pointing out the book that I just published and the coincidence of the completion of and publication and distribution of the book with everything that has happened. I don't know if that was the Holy Spirit or some other spirit who made that happen that way, but it did happen this way. And so the details of the autocephalous movement in Ukraine are covered in the book. I have found it in the previous weeks and months to be challenging to really get underneath the surface to explain the perspective of the proponents for autocephaly in Ukraine, what motivates them and what the impetus for autocephaly has been. So my paper today is an experiment in that I am a novice when it comes to postcolonial theory. By no means, I'm a liturgist, so by no means am I an expert in postcolonial theory, but this is an attempt to explain with some clarity the motivations for the proponents for autocephaly in Ukraine, with the understanding that Ukraine, the Orthodox population in Ukraine is large, diverse, and is inclusive of numerous differing and variant opinions, not only on autocephaly, but on how the process of autocephaly should or should have unfold or unfolded. So, in the 9 months that have elapsed since Ukrainian President Poroshenko announced that the Ecumenical Patriarchate was going to grant autocephaly, the discussion has been dominated by fierce debates on historical and canonical claims to Ukraine's territory by the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the Moscow Patriarchate. These debates continue, but I believe that there is an alternative. So I will offer an analysis of the Ukrainian case for autocephaly by bringing select events from the core of the movement into dialogue with postcolonial theory, primarily the contributions of Gayatri Spivak and Homi Bhabha. The Kievan Metropolia functioned as the Orthodox Church for the Ukrainian people among other peoples throughout the medieval period, even though Ukraine was not a sovereign state. When the Hetmanate created a union with the Russian Empire with the Treaty of Pereyaslav in 1654, the Kievan Metropolia was still under the Patriarchate of Constantinople. Constantinople authorized the Patriarch of Moscow to ordain the Metropolitan of Kiev in 1686, a canonical act that Moscow interprets as a complete transfer of jurisdiction. For the next 300 plus years, the Orthodox Church in Ukraine was gradually Russified and occasionally experienced tensions with Moscow. As Ukrainian national consciousness developed in the 19th and 20th centuries, some clergy began to dream of the possibility of ecclesial autonomy, and what they dreamt of was a restoration of the pre-1686 Kievan Metropolia as an autocephalous church on the basis of the nation state, of the Balkanization, if you will, of ecclesial autocephaly. Achieving autocephaly would be possible only if clergy and faithful were no longer subordinate to the church authorities who were loyal to the Tsar. The first window of opportunity arrived for Ukrainian autocephaly when the Tsarist regime collapsed and Ukrainian independence became possible. The collapse of the Tsarist regime in 1917 did not end Russian ecclesial colonization of Ukraine, because the Tsarist presence was manifest in the bishops forming the Patriarchal Exarchate in Ukraine. Formed in the context of the empire, they held authority in the church and were symbols of imperial colonial power. Following Spivak's presentation of Jacques Derrida, I designate them as dominant foreign elites. The Ukrainian autocephalist proponents are subalterns, lower-ranking clergy and laity who had assumed control up until this point, neither of their destiny nor of their historical narrative, but were on the verge of finding their voices. I follow Bhabha by depicting the task of the bishops as reforming the Ukrainian subalterns so that they would mimic the ideal Russian Orthodox citizen. The Ukrainians would remain different, inferior, and subordinate in this framework because their distinctiveness would hypothetically threaten the safety of the civilization of the Russian world of the Moscow Patriarchate. The activities of the patriarchal bishops align with the role of dominant foreign elites who keep the colonized citizens in order. The first instance of subaltern finding their voices and challenging the authority of the dominant episcopal elites came in 1918 with the convocation of an all-Ukrainian church council, and the participants in the council all testified to the relentless campaign for both autocephaly and Ukrainization by the autocephalist clergy and laity. As dominant foreign elites, the patriarchal bishops maintained order through a hybrid strategy of manipulating representation to remove autocephalists from the council and delegitimizing the subalterns as threats to the stability of church civilization. This occurred when Bishop Pimen authorized 52 unelected representatives from Kherson to participate in the 1918 council, while prohibiting the pro-autocephaly members of the Ukrainian Church Committee, who had been voting delegates all along, from participating. In other words, from the Ukrainian perspective, the dominant foreign elite patriarchal bishops allegedly violated procedure through fraudulent election tactics, and then justified those decisions by casting the pro-Ukrainian cohort as a potential menace. And this was epitomized by Metropolitan Feodosy Protsiuk's justification of the removal of these Ukrainian delegates as, quote, separatists, who would eventually form the core of the first Ukrainian autocephalist church in 1921. This pattern of conflict between the Ukrainian subaltern clergy and the dominant foreign elites continued from 1919 to 1921, as the subalterns obtained permission from the Soviet authorities to register parishes that celebrated liturgy in vernacular Ukrainian and not Church Slavonic. The initial response of the patriarchal bishops was to impose canonical sanctions. In other words, to keep order for the sake of the church civilization as an imperial structure. The patriarchal bishops instructed Orthodox faithful to choose between the, quote, Ukrainians and the, quote, Orthodox. This strategy is an instance of Baba's description of mimicry, an attempt of the imperial colonizers to reform the subalterns into resembling the occupiers up until a certain point. The remaining difference, the up until, serves as a reminder that the colonized subalterns are a potential menace to the order of the imperial civilization. In our case, the Ukrainian autocephalists are the subalterns whose desire to be themselves by praying in their native language and retaining their native customs poses a threat to the stability of a united Ukrainian, Russian, Belarusian, Moscow patriarchate. This initial series of conflicts in the church between the Ukrainian subalterns and the colonizing patriarchal bishops established the pattern for the struggle for autocephaly that persisted until it reached a point of no return with the Maidan Revolution in 2013. It is crucial to note new developments that illustrate how this struggle has reached its penultimate point. The first significant note is a swift shift in the tactics of the Ukrainian subalterns. Having failed to achieve autocephaly through canonical means, they adopted subversion through separatism, severing relations with the patriarchal church by convoking their own council in October 1921 and creating a new church from scratch. The subversive act resonated with many Ukrainians, especially intellectuals, but the subaltern strategy was flawed. They miscalculated the readiness of the rest of the Orthodox world to accept their method of conciliar ordination as legitimate, and the outcome was to the temporary advantage of the colonizers who had aligned Ukrainian identity with uncanonical orthodoxy. After the Yalta Agreement of 1945, all of Ukraine, including the West, which had been under Habsburg or Polish rule, was annexed to the Soviet Union, and the tepid alliance of the Moscow Patriarchate with the Soviet regime completely snuffed out subversion as a viable method for both Greek Catholics and Orthodox autocephalists in Ukraine. The Moscow Patriarchate's orchestration of a false council in Lviv in 1946 subjugated both autocephalists and Greek Catholics to the Moscow Patriarchate anew with two significant changes. The narrative of the colonizers held that this forced union was necessary for the safety and stability of Soviet society, since Greek Catholics and Orthodox who fought for Ukrainian sovereignty during the war were cast as fascist sympathizers who were saved by the Soviets. The action of forcibly assimilating Greek Catholics and autocephalists into the Moscow Patriarchate is another instance of Baba's notion of mimicry. These faithful would be reshaped into resembling the ideal Soviet citizen, whose religious profession happens to be legal in the Soviet Union, the Russian Orthodox Church. The second change confirms this act as one of mimicry. The state and the church honored Ukrainian otherness by permitting mild Ukrainization for the first time in modern history, especially through the publication of a periodical in the Ukrainian language. The Ukrainian episcopate finally included ethnic Ukrainians, and for the first time in modern history, an ethnic Ukrainian, the controversial Metropolitan Filaret Denysenko, no relation, presided over the patriarchal exarchate. I always have to clarify that, even though we affectionately refer to him as Dядя Fiля at home. The mild Ukrainization of the church marked a transition of leadership from dominant foreign elites to dominant indigenous elites in the church. During the long period of the Cold War, the subaltern Ukrainians retained their distinctiveness by abandoning subversion and instead working within the system and style appropriate for Soviet citizens by defending their rights through letters to the authorities with numerous references to Soviet law. Ukrainian historian Natalia Shlichta has meticulously documented this strategy employed by the Ukrainian subalterns throughout the course of the Cold War for one sole purpose: survival. The subaltern strategy of survival paid off for Greek Catholics and Orthodox autocephalists when the Soviet government loosened restrictions on religious rights by restoring legal status to the Greek Catholic and Ukrainian autocephalist churches in 1989, before the end of the Soviet Union. No longer restrained by a watchful and vengeful regime, both churches established centers in West Ukraine and immediately challenged the long-standing hegemony of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine. The goals of these two churches were nearly achieved when Ukraine declared independence in 1991, but one obstacle remained for Ukrainian autocephalists: the continued presence of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine, now ruled by dominant indigenous elites. In the immediate aftermath of Ukrainian independence, those indigenous elites sensed that liberation from imperial control was possible and petitioned their colonial superiors in Moscow for autocephaly on two occasions, first in November 1991 and again in April 1992. When the episcopate of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church unanimously signed letters petitioning Moscow for autocephaly. Moscow rejected both appeals and alleged that the bishops of the episcopate were coerced into signing the document. Moscow's rejection of these appeals for autocephaly follows the colonial pattern mentioned earlier. The leaders of the Moscow Patriarchate alleged that the new Ukrainian political powers at the time, Leonid Kravchuk, were influencing the autocephalous movement and therefore posed a menacing threat to the safety of imperial civilized order, a description that fits the colonial strategy for civilized order described by Spivak and the dismissal of otherness when it poses a threat described by Baba. The Moscow Patriarchate's colonial elites of 1991 to 1992 employed the same strategy used to retain order originally employed in 1920 to 21. By removing Metropolitan Filaret as the initiator of subversion, they depicted him and his followers as illegitimate allies of a dangerous political order. Having forsaken his previous power as a dominant indigenous elite, Metropolitan Filaret gladly embraced the role of a subaltern who suddenly found his voice. His transformation was one of the many factors contributing to a Ukrainian attempt to seize the historical narrative from the colonial imperialists and to write their own history. Filaret revised the subaltern strategy by building a Ukrainian alternative to the Moscow Patriarchate, some say it's simply a copy, and consistently established solidarity with the people as the emerging Ukrainian nation struggled to achieve stability. While the autocephalists grew rapidly in numbers and strength from 1992 to 2013, the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine struggled to maintain the status quo of subordination to Moscow enforced by dominant indigenous elites. The dominant indigenous elites representing Russian imperialism consolidated their power after Metropolitan Volodymyr Slobodan's death and took a decisive turn to loyalty to Moscow. While many Ukrainian clergy and laity in the Moscow Patriarchate took a public stance for Ukraine against Russian aggression during the Maidan and through the war, their leaders opted for neutrality. Currently, the episcopate of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine publicly supports the territorial integrity of Ukraine, but it refuses to criticize Russian aggression and publicly protests Ukraine's part in the war. And here I would like to add make note of the precarious position of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine, holding together a very large, both regional and ethnic constituency, especially in the post-2013 period. And I would call attention, or at least mention, both Dr. Suslov's and Father Cyril's works. Dr. Suslov has an excellent article discussing Russian Orthodox attitudes, both official and unofficial, on Ukrainians in the Maidan, and Father Cyril also mentions them in his book on political orthodoxies. And the depictions of those who support the Maidan include that they are possessed by Satan, that these are demon-possessed people. And so this is a position that the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine finds itself in attempting to hold together this complicated, challenging situation. Returning to the primary advocates for autocephaly, the Greek Catholics and the Orthodox autocephalists during this period up until recent events publicly and sharply condemned Russian aggression. At the time, the Kievan Patriarchate in particular depicted Russian President Vladimir Putin as the new Cain and joined Ukraine's president and parliament in calling for the end of Ukraine's colonization through the formation of an autocephalous church no longer governed by dominant foreign or indigenous elites. In the post-Maidan period, it would seem that Ukraine's Orthodox subalterns have achieved the elusive aspiration of Spivak by finding their voices and speaking publicly. The process of assuming control of their own narrative is essentially irreversible at this point. Ironically, the dominant indigenous elites of the Moscow Patriarchate have attempted to change their identity by claiming that they are the real subalterns, whose fate is determined by the new political elites in post-Soviet Ukraine. And I'm sure you got all of that. The final wrinkle in the strategy of the Ukrainian autocephalists was to obtain the advocacy of a moral authority in the Orthodox world in the Ecumenical Patriarchate, who is now the new advocate for the autocephalists in achieving their cause. The Moscow Patriarchate rejects this development and claims that the Ecumenical Patriarchate has capitulated to the menace posed by the Ukrainians seeking to end Russian colonialism through the Church. In the most recent developments, it is essential to show that the dominant foreign elites, the official spokespeople of the Moscow Patriarchate, have seized control of almost all public declarations on this issue. They have taken back the power granted to the dominant indigenous elites, the leaders of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine, as a demonstration of their subordination and the failure of the leaders of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine to properly maintain imperial order in Ukraine. Moscow's strategy fits Baba's description of a civilizing mission employed by imperial colonialists. By exposing the failure of their Ukrainian subordinates to achieve the Russian civilizing mission, they justify the need to retain Ukrainian subjection to Moscow. From this Russian colonialist perspective, the Ukrainians are unable to maintain order on their own. They are doomed to fail and therefore need dependence on the Moscow Patriarchate as the Russian imperialist ecclesial structure. This move, however, smacks of desperation, since the Ukrainian subalterns seem to have obtained the advocacy of a third party who recognizes the colonial imperialist and not the colonized subjects as the true menace to the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. In this presentation, I've attempted to present an alternate view of the advocates for autocephaly on the Ukrainian case by bringing it into dialogue with postcolonial theory. The final outcome of a subaltern movement that began 100 years ago is that the Ukrainian subalterns have found their voice and have achieved their goal of ecclesial independence that is recognized by the ecumenical patriarchate through the formation of what is officially now known as the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. In the next few years, this newly established Orthodox Church of Ukraine will go through the arduous process of adjusting to its new role. This church bears multiple identities. It is anchored in the complex memory of colonized Orthodox people in Ukraine who were historically coerced into resembling their colonizers while fighting to maintain their distinctiveness. It is also a community of faithful that has found its voice, reclaimed its narrative, and exposed the tyranny of the colonizers. The Orthodox Church of Ukraine is now in the liminal stage of entering a post-colonial period. Its people are no longer subalterns subjugated to a foreign empire, but its leaders are now the dominant elites in a multi-religious society, having achieved their goal through a convenient alliance with the state during a time of war. In this sense, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine is a survivor of colonialism and has become the author of its own narrative. The risks posed to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine are daunting. With autocephaly achieved, it no longer enjoys the status of a vulnerable subaltern. Much of its history is a testimony to fighting for liberation from colonial tyranny. The Orthodox Church of Ukraine has been the most vocal critic of the dominant elites who represented the presence and authority of the colonial tyrant in the church in Ukraine. Now that they have claimed this authority, how will they relate to minority churches, to the marginalized and disenfranchised subalterns of Ukrainian society? Will the adrenaline of the triumph over colonizers transform this new church from subaltern to a tyrant who persecutes and abuses Moscow Patriarchate communities in Ukraine? Will the Orthodox Church of Ukraine be a tool of political powers and use its authority to establish a new version of civilized order that is deemed appropriate by others for Ukraine? Furthermore, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine employed the moral authority of the Ecumenical Patriarchate to achieve autocephaly. The Ecumenical Patriarch's response to Ukraine's repeated appeals has been costly, as Moscow responded swiftly and severely, and many of the sister churches up until this point have been hesitant and reluctant to publicly support the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Despite hesitance, reluctance, the Ecumenical Patriarchate delivered on his promise despite formidable opposition from Moscow. The jury remains out on whether or not the church in Ukraine has cast out a malevolent tyrant only to be subordinated to an ambivalent one. The history of Ukrainian Orthodox subaltern strategy concluded the most recent chapter by appealing to a third party instead of resolving their own issues without external intervention. Soon enough, the nature of the new relationship between the Ukrainian Church and the Ecumenical Patriarchate will be known, especially if the independence promised the Ukrainian Church proves to be fleeting. Thank you for your attention.